Good evening, everybody, and welcome. I'm going to talk this evening about performance layering and give you something I hope to take away and improve your comfort or the performance of your garments, or take away some of the confusion that occurs because of all the marketing that's going on. And so performance layering is how to understand what each layer does, and sometimes more importantly, what it doesn't do. And the process of selecting and sequencing all those the layers that you need is actually quite a complex process. It's a skill, not simply a knowledge, and it's not simply around the three-layer concept, which doesn't work. We also do as outdoor gear coach, we do one-day courses, which are treated as CPD for mountain leaders and AMDs and guides and so on. And the picture you see on the left is the front cover of the book we have written. I'll tell you more about that later. Just some fun stories about my first trip with the Eagles, which was in 1967 in Grindelwald, quite some time ago. And I guess not many of you might be skiing at that time. I wasn't an Eagles member at that time, but I was a member of the SDGB and had seen an advert for a ski touring course, and I was a racing bike rider, and I thought, oh, that would be fun because I like touring. And this was with a guy called Neil Hogg. His brother was Quinton Hogg, who was a legal person high up in the society. And the guide on this trip was Herman Story, and he was the head of the Grindelwald Guides. And I guess some of you may have heard of the name Arnold Lunn, famous for founding various institutions, including Lunn Poly and so on. Now, this was only my third year of skiing, and we were into deep, deep powder. And that was a shock. And I was almost giving up until I finally, after a few days, did manage to start making some turns. But there was another shock, which was quite interesting now, because this was a language and a cultural shock. When I arrived there at the end of January, everyone had spent more time skiing that season than I had done in my life. But as long as I could do a few turns, that wasn't too difficult. But as you can hear, I have quite a strong Lancashire accent, but at that time I had a much stronger Lancashire accent, and everyone else was public school, which journalists nowadays refer to as Edwardian vowels, as used by some of the one or two of remaining MPs who use that language. Even the royal family don't use that Edwardian language nowadays. Anyway, just to finish, I was going up on the Grindelwald first lift on about day 4, and one lady said, "Do you know, I can't tell a word you're saying." And what's more, neither can any of the others. So that was the cultural shock. Mind you, I was rather broader spoken at that time than now. So this is me on the left on the top of Helvellyn in a snowstorm. I can see Helvellyn from my office window where I'm sat when it's daylight, of course. I've written or co-authored 3 books. together with Professor Mary Rose at Lancaster University. I'm the former owner of Karrimor and the founder of OMM, Original Mountain Marathon. And at one time I was a licensee of several different fabrics and textiles, from Sympatex, Gore-Tex, Event, Polartec, and so on. The importance of being a licensee is that you're shared lots of information on their technologies, which gives me the ability to communicate some of the information I'm giving to you today. I supplied all Bonington's major expeditions through Annapurna 70, Everest 75, and shown in the picture there are the famous or infamous Willan's boxers, which were instrumental part of the success. And my colleague, collaborator, Mary Rose, is an academic, but a textile and business historian. And so that contributed a lot, and we've partnered up for a considerable length of time. There's also additional members of the outdoor coach team. Chuck Cookler is located on the East Coast USA, just north of Boston. And he acts as our USA editor in a sense. He's an MIT researcher and used to be a chemical engineer, so he knows lots and lots about heat and heat transfer and so on. And he has a fun retirement job now at REI, teaching staff at one of the REI stores. Chris Townsend here is also part of the team, and he's the UK editor, and I'm sure some of you have heard about him and read his reports in TGO. And then we're supported by my wife, Mike Parsons, who's an AC and CC member, a long-time climber. Alan Hinks, he's done quite a few 14,000ers. Well, all 14 8,000ers, sorry. And then Stu Smith, who I think yes, he's with us now. Hi, Stu. So, performance layering. The oldest evidence of stitched clothing is 40,000 years ago, stitching. And for the glaciologists amongst you, that was just prior to the beginning of the last glacial maximum. So the reason we're still here and have survived is because those guys learned how to stitch. Quite handy. There are no artifacts surviving from that period, but we have gained a significant idea of what they have done by looking at three examples. Ötzi, who was dug up quite a long, about 20 years ago. Actually, I must have, the first ski tour I did was Invent, and my first summit was the Similarn, and I must have skied over Ötzi, but didn't know he was there until he was found 20 or 30 years later. The Aleuts are very important because they're a seafaring nation, and the Inuits we can still see around. So what did Ötzi do? Well, people are surprised when I describe how relatively sophisticated they were, although in the modern image it looks crude, but they were very sophisticated. They had a skin in the game, so to speak, in that if they didn't get it right, they wouldn't survive. So you can see all his layering, and there were no textiles, of course, in that period, so they had a skin base layer with the hair all removed, and then another skin layer, and then an outer layer which formed a grass cape. And those people knew the parts of the animals absolutely intimately and selected each part from each animal to do the exact thing required. So it was not a haphazard thing of grabbing a few skins and so on. This picture comes from the Smithsonian Institute in USA, And the Aleutian Islands are located between Alaska and Russia, and they travel between the islands in vessels, well, like kayaks rather, but they were 2 and 3 person vessels called bidarkers, and they made their waterproofs from seal intestines. That's why they look so transparent in this illustration. And interestingly, and these examples are about 150 years old, they made the seams totally waterproof by using vegetable glues, and to check that they were fully waterproof, filled them with water. Absolutely amazing. And if anyone has seen any of my products, and Stu knows these very well, the name of their garments were called Kamlaika, and I used that name on the waterproof I invented for OMM. Let's have a look at the Inuits. Of course, we've got a completely different environment again. Very dry, very cold there all the time. And their skins were used in several different ways and so on. In this case, the hood, the fur in the hood surround was always selected as wolverine, which was the fur which collected the very least frost moisture from the breath. As you can see, it would accumulate quite a lot there. So let's have just a quick resume on how we learned some while back. I know you don't go back so far, but I do. So we learned to ski as kids, growing up, playing out, getting cold. We lived in cold houses, of course, without central heating, and I still recall getting up in the morning and feet on the cold oilcloth, it was called, because there was no wall-to-wall carpets in those days, and we had to scrape the frost off the window to see out. And when we were on the hills, we learned by getting cold and wet, and garments changed very little over times. Outdoor shops had a long-standing, experienced outdoor shop with a deep knowledge of the smaller range of garments which are available. Those guys now are all retiring. However, learning today has become more about learning from advertising and videos and marketing claims. Modern marketing, as far as outdoor garments are concerned, arrived about 1980. And the brand training of retailers applies when the brands train retailers, the training they give the retailers applies only to that brand's products, which means that they're not teaching the real deep principles, and there's no certification of staff and so on. So there's a real build-up of missing understanding. So this epitomizes perhaps what we see as today's learning. So today there is no skin in the game. Here's an interesting quote that I thought must be quoted. Some of you may have read Mark Twait's book, which goes back some time, Extreme Alpinism. The layering system now told in the context of alpinism is a lie. And he was a consultant for one of the leading outdoor garment companies. His comments apply broadly, meaning that the 3-layer system doesn't work, or overlayering is the key. And he brought in what became known as the belay jacket. In other words, layer very lightly when you are moving, and when you reach the belay point, then put on overlayer with a very, very good down jacket. That's the crux. And it's really good advice, and a lot of people, not that many people, are following that advice. The next person I'm going to quote is one you know very well, Kathy, from your Mazzino Ridge Traverse. I was doing a session one weekend with the Alpine Club at the Starkey Hut in Patterdale, right next to us here, where my wife Marion is the hut warden. And he said, I realize I can no longer pick up a garment and know what it does for me. Well, why is that? Well, it's because there's been such a lot of innovation, which is very positive. But consumers today are bombarded with industry-based claims and a marketing bias. So that will be further accentuated in the coming 5 years, because everything that we use today and love and trust will change in the next 5 years. And that's because of requirements for sustainability and the up-and-coming EU legislation on the need for recyclability and repairability. So what we teach here as Outdoor Gear Coach is the principles, so that you'll be able to carry forward those principles into the garments that you will be knocking into over the next several years. So, the big picture. We've got some rather intricate diagrams on the left-hand side here. We have the good fortune of finding a guy who had done the illustrations for Gray's Anatomy, so I've always assumed that these will be reasonably accurate. And so let's go back to the key point that I'm trying to put across here. Garments don't produce heat. We do, you do. It's an obvious statement, but it's really important to draw attention to that. Metabolism turns food and drink into heat and muscle power. It goes approximately split, this is a real approximation, into about 25% heat. That's when we get overheated and have to take jackets off or whatever and adjust and so on. And the rest of it goes into glycogen, which is partially stored in the liver and partially stored in the muscles. The muscles store typically, the leg muscles and so on, typically store about 2 hours action worth of glycogen, which is why typically the marathon runners run into the wall at the 2 hour point. So what your garments are required to do is to retain some of that heat which is exuded. So let's have a look how the body, let's look now at the graphics on the left. This metabolism occurs in your stomach and essentially in the core. If there are, well, we do have medics on the program, so if they have points they would like to draw out or so on, I'd appreciate that. And so this is the metabolism is a chemical process, and if you're a chemist, you'll understand even on non-human chemical processes, they only occur at rather fine limits in terms of the exact temperatures. And so our bodies have an interesting system, so that if our body thinks that feels that the temperature in our core is dropping rather too low so that we can't metabolize, it says, okay, I'm gonna cut off the circulation to hands and feet. Hey, and there's a little app. Oh, sorry. I'm nicknaming it an app. If you look at the left-hand diagram, there is a feature within the brain called the hypothalamus, and it is that which activates this process. And you'll see that there is a vasoconstriction occurring, which causes your hands and feet to go cold. So hypothermia is not simply getting cold. Hypothermia is your core being unable to metabolize. Okay, let's have a look now at this high expectation we have of our garments. Look at the diagrams here on the right. There's this diagram of the man with the food, water, fitness, and so on. And if you look at this, we are trying to achieve moisture management. We're trying to achieve almost the opposite. We're trying to look at the red arrow at the bottom. We're trying to keep heat in. The next red arrow, we're trying to release some heat. The blue arrow, we're trying to wick out some moisture. And then we're also at the same time expecting our garments to reflect wind. Well, if today no garments existed and someone came up with that expectation, they would say, well, no, we don't think that's possible. And so the overview is that garments don't do everything for you. We need to have some understanding so that we're selecting the right things and doing the constant adjustment of what we're doing as we're going on. So I have selected a few words here, which are the most commonly misunderstood, and I'll go through them. And if there are questions coming up, you can put questions in the text at the side, or on Kathy, or someone will pick them up. Or you can wave a hand and so on, and Kathy will make a decision on whether to take a question immediately. And I'm also giving you my email at the end for further questions if required. So wicking, insulation, breathability, waterproof, DWR, which stands for durable water repellent, windproof, size, fit and grade, and care and maintenance. So wicking. Journalists today even talk about wicking and so on as absorption. It is not absorption. Wicking is a capillary flow between narrow gaps between the fibers, or in fact, between any gaps. For example, if you have an older house like I do, and have rising dam, that is capillary flow. And if you look around you and see all plants and trees and so on, they feed themselves by capillary flow, which rises right up through the plant to a very high level in high trees. So let's have a look at what the base layer really does. It has knitted loops which hold air. It needs to be dry air. And the wicking wicks the sweat away from the body, which does two things. One, it avoids loss of heat by the water conducting heat away, and it avoids that sweat evaporating from the skin, which would cause evaporative cooling again. So here's another way of explaining it. Uh, if you acquire two capillary tubes of different diameters, very different diameters, and you insert them into a bowl of ink-filled water, you will see that the thinner the tube, the higher it rises. So microfibers are often talked about in literature in garments. One of the things they do is to make the garment softer with a nice feel to it. However, the key in terms of wicking is illustrated here. You can see that with the microfiber yarn filament on the right hand side, you will see that there are many more gaps in blue than there are on the left drawing, so that this microfiber transports more water than the one on the left. However, there is a snag to this wicking in that it moves water in all directions, inwards, upwards, but not necessarily in the direction that you require. I recall many years ago, I had a trip in Patagonia, and this was the first time it really impacted on me. And I was with John Clare and a bunch of others from the Alpine Club, and it was raining like Patagonia and Scotland know how. And after a couple of days, some of the guys were complaining that they were getting wet. When we had a look at each other, I was the only one who was keeping dry. So they were accusing me of supplying them with the wrong thing, the wrong garment, because I'd fixed them with some kit. And then I realized that they weren't using the same base layers, the same leggings as I was. They were using the sort of fabrics which would cause the damp to rise inwards and upwards. And so today, about once or twice a year, I come across people, friends, who have bought a really, really good, expensive waterproof jacket, but they're saying it's leaking. And when I look, it's the fact that they have had a protruding sleeve, which is wicked in the water, and they thought the garment was leaking. So rising damp is a problem. So how do we solve that? Well, there's a thing called a directional wicking, which no one really talks about. There is one company, however, who uses it as their complete concept, and that's Karrimor. And they weren't the first with it. The first people to invent a textile was Touring, the largest textile company in the world. And they did that in 1984. And Nick Brown, who started Nick Wax and Karrimor, realized the concept. And I remember him talking to me early on in the days before he started his company. And he was talking to me about his samples and getting them going and so on. And many of you, I'm sure, are using Karrimor garments. But what is very interesting to note is that you should be, to keep dry in difficult wet weather, you should be using underneath directional wicking garments. So you can buy those either from Karrimor or you can buy them from Polartec. So, for example, Power Stretch was launched in 1990, and I used those, well, a lot of the time, even just going for a walk locally in the last few weeks, certainly when I'm wet weather walking, I have an over trouser over the top. And oh, that says powder dry. It should say power dry. That's a base layer from Polartec. And then Karrimor has several garments there. So when you wanted to keep dry in the wet, look at something which is directional wicking. There's something interesting as well in that it, if you get water going through, it spreads the water over a larger area, so that if that's your outer layer, it will speed up the evaporation. If it's the inner layer, it works what Karrimor says they call their inner layer the pump liner. There's no pumping done. It's a directional wicking fabric, so that it tends to absorb across the layer, and the heat that you are generating in your body will, over the course of time, hopefully dry it out. So, what is the best insulator? Normally, if I'm face-to-face with the group, I ask people to respond to the questions and so on, but I'll give you the answer in this case: dry air. Now, in talks I've done before, and I've asked for feedback, one of the things that surprised me is the thing that has surprised people, and in some cases they've said that the most surprising thing was that water conducts heat 25 times faster than dry air. So that's the reason why it is absolutely critical that we keep water out of the system. And that's a process we all have to manage. It's not done by magical garments for us. We have to manage that process by understanding those layers. So let's have a look at what the methods are of providing that, providing garments to hold the air. Well, all the knitted pullovers, the fleece, and so on, and down jackets are all methods of holding dry air. That's it. The first down sleeping bags used on a mountain was Alfred Mummery in 1895. He disappeared. I don't think he's ever been found. He disappeared on Nanga Parbat. The first proper down jacket was created by George Finch, and some of you may have read his book, Making of a Mountaineer. This guy was only on the 1922 expedition. He was the only one who was really warm enough. They laughed at him, and they didn't take it forward and use it for the 24 expedition. I'll talk in a moment about the 1924 layer was used by Mallory. But those were very simple constructions. So if you look at the diagrams on the right-hand side here, the initial construction as used by George Finch was the so-called stitch-through construction, and he probably didn't have the optional inner layer, as you can see on that diagram. And so there was plenty of dry air there in those pockets, but there was a weakness in that there was through stitching. And that problem wasn't solved until in the 1940s. Eddie Bauer in USA created the box wall construction, which you can see on the subsequent diagrams as you go to the right there. And you can see those are much, much warmer, and you'll pay much, much more for those. And they're much bulkier. They are the real puffer things. The last person to make very significant things was a French guy called Pierre Alain. Climbers of my generation remember PA as the man who introduced the smooth rock climbing boot. And in the 1960s, he created a combination of a short sleeping bag. This was a bivvying outfit, I think you would call it. It was a combination of a short sleeping bag, which he named in French a pied d'éléphant, an elephant's foot, a down jacket to come down to meet it at the waist, and the whole was covered over with a long waterproof, which was very popular, became very popular. The word cagoule is a French word just meaning awning or covering, but it became known very well indeed in the UK. Cagoules were very common. We probably don't use that word very much now, but it was a very, very popular garment in the 70s and 80s and so on. Usually referred to as a cag. Let's have a look at something about moisture vapor breathability. Well, nowadays I wring my hands in despair because just about every journalist or whatever, except Chris Townsend, of course, is referring to almost everything that moves is breathable. And indeed, all garments, even ladies' lingerie, is referred to as breathable. So the whole meaning of the word is more or less nullified, it's disappeared. So what we should be talking about is the ability for a garment or a layer or a textile to transmit the moisture vapor that is inside. And it's measured as moisture vapor transmission rate. There is also another rating which is called RET, which is used by Gore, but so there's two different ratings. It measures the amount of water released. So if you're looking at garments, just to give you some idea, 10,000 rating is rather low. 20,000 is good and achievable with most coated fabrics. 30,000 is about the highest level and only achievable with microporous laminates, of which Gore is the dominant design product. Event is also there, but it's not so frequently sold now. And please note there are 5 different levels of Gore-Tex, giving all sorts of different benefits. So what we've got here is the invention of the various elements, polymers that were used. Hydrophilic PU is a very important compound that more or less no one has ever heard of. And that's because it was never created as a brand. It was created almost in parallel with Gore-Tex by the British Ministry of Defence as a replacement for Ventile cotton fabrics. And they were able to succeed. This development was done in Manchester. They were able to succeed to create a polyurethane which could transmit the moisture vapor. And at the same time, Gore-Tex came out with their expanded. Now, Gore-Tex were already using PTFE, and they found just by chance that by expanding it very quickly, it became microporous. However, what they didn't realize was that after the product was in use for some time, the rainwater would back wick. So what they had to do is to put some PU into it, hydrophilic PU. But that was a secret until rather 10 years after the launch. And so it is also the reason why Gore-Tex is not microporous. It is not air porous. So let's have a look now on number 3, which is a hydrophilic polyester. That's Sympatex, was created in 85. And then we have DWR finishes, which go on the outer surface of the fabric, which create the beading, which stops the back wicking through. And so, to summarize, using Gore-Tex's own membrane explanations, what you have here is, if you see in the circle at the top, you have a skimming of DWR, which has no thickness, it's just chemical. And that, until the last year, that was always a fluoro compound, and it has now had to be removed completely. So the garments you are buying from now on are, good news, safer for the environment. Bad news, not so good in performance, and you will have to wash them more frequently. Otherwise, they will wet out and you'll get more condensation. Then there is a face fabric, the textile. It's always woven, tightly woven. And then there is the PTFE, and then backing that is the hydrophilic PU within the membrane and the holes itself. So, breathable. What the marketing doesn't tell you. Whoa. Well, no breathable waterproof fabric can release all the sweat we push out at maximum. Yes, if I could see you, some of you should be nodding your head. The sweat only moves outwards when the temperature, pressure, humidity combination inside the garment is greater than outside. As you may imagine, and as you have probably found, that is not always the case. In addition, if your garment is soiled or dirty, we don't mean very dirty, we only mean very slight things like brushing your hands against it after you've had a sandwich or something like that, then the outer surface, the rainwater landing on it, will spread out rather than beading up and rolling off. And at that point, the moisture vapor transmission rate, MVTR, drops seriously, and you get sweating up. And inward wicking can occur in a worst case scenario. So how do we deal with all this sweat we're pumping out? Well, even if you're competing in an event, you try lowering your pace. If, for example, you're ending up in a tent for the night, whether you are expeditioning or whether you are eventing, think about just slowing up and allowing your body heat to push things through and dry things out a little bit. Layering skills, of course, and ventilating continuously, monitoring and opening up and thing. Some garments are fitted with some outer garments are fitted with a pit zip, so don't forget to use those. Next is the key one. The windproof is the forgotten garment. And our advice is only use waterproofs when it's raining. And almost always use a wind shell. What's a wind shell? A typical brand is called Pertex. And that is windproof, but it's much more, it doesn't have an MVTR rating because it doesn't need one, because it releases a lot more sweat. So the benefits of using that, a wind shell, is that you don't sweat up so much. You also extend the life of your very expensive outerwear jacket, and you don't have to wash it and reproof it so frequently. So this also fits with the Mark Twight principle: use light layers when moving, and when on belay, use a down jacket. And when I'm advising other groups, I'm saying, yeah, okay, I know you're not on belay. You don't go on a belay, but just think of the down jacket that you're carrying as the spare, as your lunchtime break stop jacket, your picnic jacket. It's just the same use. Have a think about why the duck and the duckling continue to float on water. Well, birds, if you think about it, are continuously grooming themselves, and birds, particularly which are water floating and swimming and so on, do have a special oil somewhere in the neck area, and they stroke their beak, pick it up, and they are constantly grooming their feathers with this oil and keeping everything in very good shape. And I think that's an interesting example of how birds keep themselves flying and keep themselves buoyant in the water. And it's a lesson for us. Look after your stuff, not just your outer. Your garments, which are wicking garments, also needed to be washed and treated in the right way in order that they continue to be wicking. Let's have a look at waterproofing now. Lots of myths here again. Waterproof is a relative term. Tents are a low hydrostatic head, whereas garments are low hydrostatic head. Hydrostatic head is often quoted as HH. A meter is the technical definition of being waterproof. That's the BS standard for waterproofness, 1 meter hydrostatic head. But in a garment where you have lots and lots of flexing and brushing and so on, if it was only 1 meter, it would leak very, very soon. And so we need 10 meters is the minimum, 20 meters is good, and 25 millimeters is good. Whereas a tent outer layer only needs 2 meters and 3 meters for the tent ground sheets, because you're kneeling on them from time to time. Well, quite a lot actually. So waterproofing is a relative term. Fitness for purpose in different types of Gore-Tex fabrics. And what I've done here is compared 2 typical Gore-Tex jacket fabrics. Excuse the hand-drawn graphic for the moment. But I want to show you the difference between Gore-Tex Pro, which is the red zigzag, and Gore-Tex Active, which is the black zigzag. So I'm looking at 3 measures here. One is the hydrostatic head, which we've talked about, and the other is the MVTR, which we've talked about, and the other is simply the durability. In other words, and durability is related to the thickness and so on, and thickness has an important influence on the durability and the strength of the textile. However, the thicker it is, the stronger it is, and the slower is the MVTR. So if we look at these 2 fabrics and we look at the headings at the bottom, starting at the top, Gore-Tex Pro starts with a very high hydrostatic head, but if we follow the arrow down, we can see that it has a lower MVTR. And if we look up again, you can see that it's very high durability. However, Gore Active, which is designed for products and garments which are more active, for running or skiing or so on and so on, running, is much lighter, The hydrostatic head, as you can see, is significantly lower, but you are getting a much higher MVTR. But it's much more fragile, you can see from the arrow going down at the bottom. So those arrows are not to scale. It is a conceptual drawing, so that I'm enabling you to understand, hopefully, just what it is you're getting and not getting. Here's the 6 waterproof shell options that are available today, but this is changing very rapidly now. You can still buy waxed cotton or polycotton from brands like Fjällräven, Barber, and so on, but they're not used so frequently, except in Scandinavia or for motorbikers and so on. Hydrophilic PU coating is lower cost than the laminates, and that's very widely available. Laminated EPTFE is being replaced already by EPE because of sustainability. PTFE has a fluoro compound to it, F meaning fluoro, so those are being eliminated. So that's being replaced by EPE, E polyester. Hydrophilic polyester film is being continued. External fabric, external coatings, those are largely being discontinued, and the directional wicking, the linear gradient that I've described, is still going strong, but is so little misunderstood. But I hope you can improve your own techniques by using that. Let's look further forward on moisture management. You can see we're trying to improve to do the impossible here. It's very much about working with and managing surface tension. Wicking and capillary action are both surface tension effects, but the opposite poles, different levels of surface tension. Because of weaving technology changes and so on, there's a new generation of fabrics that have come out which are not so fully windproof as Pertex Quantum. However, they are creating all sorts of strange words for them just to make sure that everything is pretty confusing. So instead of using a measure of windproofing like cubic feet a minute, they're talking about direct venting, dynamic air exchange, air interchange, and active insulation. And those are 5 different expressions from 5 different brands. So how on earth are we to understand what on earth they are trying to do? Just a quick through on tailoring for function. Garments are shaped in different ways for the different activities. A cycle jacket is shaped quite differently with a shorter front and a longer back than is a mountain jacket and RC jacket. And the choice of hoods is very critical indeed, especially for skiing when you're moving in bad conditions. And this finally is the performance layering layers, the 6 layers we recommend to have available for trips anywhere at all times. And the key one that may interest you is that the base layer does not keep you cool. So you should have a hot weather layer, a loose shirt. Everybody has different tolerance to heat, but it's becoming more and more critical nowadays with climate change. So you need a loose shirt. It could be even cotton or polyester, and you take your base layer off and you just use the loose shirt. And then we are back to the primary thing. We are allowing our body to do what evolution gave us the power to do, and is to cool ourselves by evaporative cooling. And then the wind shell, the middle layer, and the waterproof layer, and the outer insulation. And we have also listed the emergency layer, which many of you, I'm sure, use. And I'm proud to say that the first bothy bag I created as Karrimor, and we originally called it the Kiss You, and that was way back in the 70s, but it's now become an essential piece of kit, at least for Brits and for Scandinavians. But as we can see from the 2018 Beast of the East disaster, the Italian guide didn't have one. So that's it. I hope some of you would like to buy our book. And I think I hope this talk will help you, and the book will help you achieve better results from your existing layers, or make a better purchase for other layers or alternative layers. Thank you. Any questions?
Great. Thank you, Mike. Wow. I can see in the questions, we've got some people who've dug really deep, and some of us are probably feeling a little overwhelmed. I'm going to pick up an easy question from Susie. What's your view of merino as a base layer?
Great. If you, the options for base layers are either merino wool or polyester. There's very occasionally polyamide, which is nylon. Merino wool does not wick. That's not a problem because although it absorbs the moisture, the surface of the wool remains dry. So therefore it's quite safe, and it is not conducting, the moisture isn't conducting heat away, because the thermal conductivity of the wool is quite low, so low conduction, but the thread is composed of short fibers, so there's plenty of air mixed in with it, so it's a warm fiber. Whether you choose wool depends also on how much you have in your pocket, because a merino wool is much more expensive. There's also an aftercare issue in that you have to take great care that the moths don't get at it.
Okay, I'm going to do one more quick one and then open it to everyone else. In some of the Scandinavian countries, you see them swearing by this incredibly loose knit kind of net mesh base layer. What's that about?
Oh, that's a string vest, yeah.
Yes, the string vest.
I used to use one years and years ago. That is exactly the same principle as a base layer or the thing. It's a means of keeping dry air as the insulating factor. It's just that there is more layer there, and it looks a little bit strange. And sometimes it can give you better results. It can be warmer. However, a slight drawback in that, now I haven't tried this, but if you are skiing along the glacier in hot conditions and you're stripped down to the base layer, you may possibly get sunburnt through the holes.
Question from John Russell. What is your overall view of Karrimor?
I think it's really great. I use some of the garments. I don't use the outer garments so much. It is a heavier system. And so if you are in warmer weather and you have to carry it, then that's a disadvantage. If you're looking at traveling light and you're at maximum capacity and so on, then there is a weight disadvantage. What I find is that some people it's a love or hate relationship with Karrimor, but it's a very successful company in operation, and I really would praise their product, really solid. It's they have never ever used fluoro compounds, so they have a very, very good eco sustainability record and so on. And it's also mainly polyester, which is again a reason for the reason for the slightly heavier weight, because polyesters are heavier than nylons and so on. So yeah, in very sustained, continuous rain and so on, day long and so on, yeah, you may have a problem because it does become pretty soaked. I don't personally have the experience of using it for a long sustained period in wet weather. What some people do, I've heard them doing, is if they have a long sustained period, they might have a very light coated waterproof to go over the top. Yeah. And some people say no. I remember a friend of mine in the Alpine Club was on an expedition and they were caught in very, very difficult snow conditions. And he did better in his paramour than other people with Gore-Tex, yeah, in heavy snow. Yeah. So again, it's about understanding the textiles and the materials, understanding what you are doing, deciding, and it's also about what your activities are. Yeah. You know, so for example, you wouldn't use paramour if you were doing an event because light, keeping very light is paramount.
Right, great. Question from Andy Perkins. He asks if we can go back to the previous slide about the order of the 6 layers, and asking specifically, should the wind shell be under or over the mid layer?
Depends on the day, and that's where your skill comes in. I would often layer the wind shell directly over the base layer. But in colder conditions, you might put it over the mid layer. But this is all about the skill of layering. Is not the possession of layers. Layering is a skill. And I think we are trying to propose to the BMC and the MTUK that layering be looked at as a skill, and it be eventually long term be a qualification. After all, there is a qualification now for camping, and camping has layers and layering, and it has difficulties of the issues of keeping warm and dry in a similar sort of way as garment layers. So yeah.
Andy, anything you want to add to that discussion? No, okay. Question from Robert W. Have you got views on the various wash-in treatments for outer layers?
Yes. Many people in the past have not really thought about washing and reproofing their outer layers. In fact, many people didn't seem to realize that they really needed to do that. But 22 years ago, approximately, Greenpeace blew the whistle on fluoro compounds. The last of the garments which are sold with a DWR finish with a fluoro compound on the outer side arrived last year or this season. Yeah, that's it. All the garments you're buying from now on don't have fluoro compounds, and you'll have to care for them much more carefully. So they need washing in. So there's no real difference between soap and detergent, yeah. But you need to ensure that the garment is washed clean of the soap or the detergent. Otherwise, things will go wrong, yeah, because they will cause back wicking. So you must make sure that they're fully washed and fully dried, and then You do there's lots of different compounds around nick wax, which I've already mentioned, and 2 or 3 others, yeah, and they're all, I think, probably very similar. But also remember that you do need to treat your base layers. They don't automatically continue to wick. There's a different treatment for that, so look after those. If your outer garment has become badly abraded and the surface textiles are being slightly raised, you may not have noticed, but if you re-examine it, you may, with great care, finally iron it. And that would have the benefit of ironing in the proofing. Now, this is never spoken about on the recommendations because the manufacturers are really scared that you would do a bad job and burn a hole in the garment, yeah? So they don't say that. So if you do burn a hole in your garment, don't blame me, but use the iron at a very cool temperature, and it could help the continuity of the proofing compound.
Right, fascinating. This is complicated. Question from Charlie. Are there any modern fabrics or systems that you can see having any significant changes or improvements on our current layering system?
No one will be in a position to predict exactly what is coming. The EU is working hard on new rules for recyclability and repairability and the elimination of harmful chemicals like the fluoro compounds. Where exactly, how exactly garments will perform when all that is being executed, no one really knows. I don't know. But if you were asked me to guess, I would say it probably will not be as good. The liberal use of a great number of different chemicals and compounds and so on without a knowledge of exactly how bad they would be for the environment, or the inhibition of recycling and so on and so on, all those things are being eliminated. So no one knows how they would work, but no one is going to tell you that it's going worse. I have said to one well-known high-performance brand product manager, I have the suspicion that garment performance probably topped out 2 years ago, and he said, I think you are right. So I'm back to my original concept, understanding what your layers, understanding the principles, understanding what they do and what they don't do is going to become even more important for the future.
Right. Thank you. Alan Sloan, do you want to put your mic on and ask your question?
Thanks, Kathy. Hello, Mike.
Hi.
I noticed you mentioned that if it wasn't raining, you should take your jacket off, I believe, to sort of rest it so you're not filling it with more sweat. That I may or may not have understood that correctly. But the other thought would be, if it's not raining and your jacket's wet, by using the breathability thing, you'd be using your body heat to dry it out a bit, therefore you'd keep it on. So can you put me right on that one?
Okay. Right. We're looking at 2 different issues here. I said, well, how do we deal with all the sweat that's there? And I said, for example, slow down. If you're in a competition, maybe that sounds anathema, but in actual fact, in a competition, you are in reality competing with yourself, unless you're at the very top end. So slowing down half an hour before you get into camp will help drive off and drive through and dry out your garment. Yeah. But don't confuse that with the other issue of not using your waterproof. Simply, your waterproof will cause you to overheat. What many people do is that, and I've seen this on ski tours, I've seen it on walks and treks and runs and so on. People go out with a base layer or maybe a warm layer over the top, and they go around the corner, the temperature changes, the wind gets up, so they don't have a wind shell, so they put their waterproof jacket on. At some point later, they are then overheating, so they arrive at a cold spot on the top of the summit, and they just simply daren't take off their waterproof to put on more warm clothing because it's just too darn cold to do that. So use a wind shell whenever you can over both the base layer and even a mid layer, particularly in winter. You know, I think for most, except in the early ski touring season, I think a wind layer over a base and a mid layer would be normally quite enough, certainly for skinning up.
Thank you for that. One thing I've acquired recently is a soft shell with a full Gore-Tex membrane, which I think could come into your category of a wind shell, because you can actually wear it in a 40-mile-an-hour wind without getting cold. And I think that would be in line with what you've just been saying there. But presumably that needs cared for and washed because it's got the Gore-Tex layer in it. The garment I'm thinking of is it's a Montane windjammer.
You use the word soft shell, and that is a very, very unclear. The industry used to use it a lot, and it's the terminology is still used on retail websites because people do searches for it, but the industry itself is tending to move away from the word soft shell because it is rather there's no clear definition of what a soft shell is. And in fact, when I've done some retail training, and in that case I had one long session describing soft shell, but you go around in circles a little bit. So for example, you could call a wind cell a soft shell. Yeah. And then I'm not quite sure, I'm not familiar with the garment you're talking about exactly, but it might be one of the new Gore-Tex garments and so on. So yeah, if you look at what's coming up, it will be challenging to understand what the manufacturers are saying. In one case, I remember one manufacturer of a thermal installation, I looked at the marking and I thought, what on earth are they trying to say here? So they mentioned a patent. So I just look up the Google patents, which is online. And a patent is somewhere where there is a no havering approach. You have to say, this is the state of the art at the moment. This is what we're doing. So after I did that, I understood what the insulation brand was doing, you know. And so I can't give you an off-the-shelf answer on that exact thing. What we do when we're doing a face-to-face session and we're talking about wind cells and soft shells, I line up a number of different garments, and soft shells are and wind shells and so on should be measured by CFM, cubic feet a minute, and not be called simply windproof, because windproof varies as much as waterproofing. And so if you look at, say, the Patagonia nano something or so on, it has they have quoted a CFM, cubic feet a minute, of about I think it's 28 CFM. And I put all the other garments on the table, and I asked people to grade them all and level them all out, put them out in order of windproofness by simply putting the textile to their mouth and blowing. And you can find out very simply whether the retailer that you choose would be happy with you doing that in store. I'm not quite sure. Certainly not allowable in the COVID period, yeah? But if you want to know if your garment is windproof, everything that's waterproof is rock solid windproof. Everything after that is very variable. So put it to your mouth and blow, and find a garment which has a rating on it, like the Patagonia Nano Air, and compare with that, so you get a rating.
Let me jump in with Adam's question, which I think bounces off this. Adam points out that on most brand websites, you see Gore-Tex jackets, waterproof jackets, insulation jackets, and then soft shells. They don't promote the windproof category. You have to really search for it. What are your thoughts on this approach by the brands? And for me, is this because the brands are putting what they think the customers are searching for, or because the brands think that these are the best options available, or what?
Well, I think the answer is quite succinct. If you're in business, would you prefer to sell a £250 garment or a £100 garment? But I also think many of the wind shell is the missing garment. I also think when I look at some of the garments that are supplied as windproof garments, I think the designers are confused. They don't know who they're aiming at. So the pocketing and the zips and the features and so on are very often not what I require anyway. So they don't know whether they're aiming at cyclists or whether they're aiming at runners or whatever and so on. It is the forgotten layer, but it's the most one of the most effective layers that that there is around. Sometimes some of the wind shells, like for this afternoon, just before I was working all day just to make sure I had this presentation correct, and I thought, oh, I need to pop out for an hour's walk just to get a breather, and then I slipped on an old marmot wind shell, but it had a slight lining to part of the garment. Yeah, so some of them do have a little bit of a lining. Basically, the basic consumer understands thickness as relating to warmth, which is certainly a strong relationship. But how warm it is depends on whether it is wind resistant or non-wind resistant. So a layer which is very thin, which is not perceived as warm and not perceived as waterproof, is a garment which is not understood by the general user. But it's one of my favorite garments.
Great, we're beginning to build up questions here, so let's try and get through them. From Daniel, any suggestions on ski touring leg wear that is wind resistant and cool on the way up and wind resistant and warm on the way down? I assume he's asking for the impossible, but how would you layer for ski touring leg wear?
If I was, for my Nordic layering, I would think that power stretch, which is quite thick and quite warm, and is a directional wicking, would be enough on its own. But when I go next month with Catherine, I'll be wearing a wind shell garment over the top, so it's not not a waterproof. However, for regular alpine ski touring, I would use again the power stretch leggings together with a regular pant, which was considered a ski touring pant, which it has the inbuilt gaiter to it. And then, according to the season, I would have a waterproof overlayer, depending on the weather, as a backstop that you could put on without obviously having to take your boots off. So you just clipped it over around your waist. When it's very cold or wet and so on, and these occasions do occur, perhaps occurring more, where you get solid rain, you need a rain shell. Yeah, so that's you need a rain shell as a backstop. You may decide you don't want to take that for the tour. Your call. That's where layering is a skill, because you've got to look at what the weather is going to likely to be.
Okay, question from Joan Norris. Do you have any views on the fairly recent development of hydrophobic down, and how would you compare that to synthetic insulation, for example, Primaloft, for a Scottish winter?
Down is rated on fill power, and that's the amount of space that in cubic inches that the down an ounce of down will take up. And so some people have a bit of a fetish on this, on having getting a down jacket from PhD, for example, which is an 850 fill power. But actually it's about 750 fill power. You've no real gains after that, because as you go better in your performance, you have with the down, you have to go lighter with the fabric, and that's self-defeating because it becomes more fragile and so on. The synthetic people are now even measuring their synthetic fill in the same way. You can't physically measure in the same way because you can't use the same measure, but they're using it. And the best Primalofts are supposed to be about 600, 650 fill power compared with 750, 850 you can get with down. Does that mean it's not so good or something? I don't know. Yeah. What has happened in this area of insulation fill has caused a lot of confusion, because up until approximately 5 years ago, both down and polyester filling would leak through the outer fabric. You still today can get the down leaking, but it's through a garment, but that it's coming through the stitching. It's not coming through the fabric. And so about 5 years ago, they invented a synthetic filling which would not fracture and would not leak. And so therefore, that's where a lot of the new soft shells are coming. And the fabric is less windproof and so on. I would think that what the waterproof down is doing is persuading or many people to think that they can use or ought to use or are possible to use their down jacket in wet conditions. You see, I live in the lakes here, and I see people walking about in insulated jackets in the rain. You know, that's the coming thing. People are using waterproof jackets less and less, but those are the tourists visiting the area. Yeah, so I'm not sure if I can give you a definitive answer on that. It's a question of looking at the issues. I would say what is much more important in choosing your garment or making the choice is to look how well the garment fits you, because that will affect its rating. You can't get a rating on that, but how it fits you at the neck and the collar and at the elbows and so on will have a greater effect on its thermal insulation effectiveness than would the difference between down and polyester. So look at the garment construction itself as a determining factor as well.
Right, question from Susie, which I echo, and so I think several other women in the group do. What's the best fabric for underwear? And so the women were particularly concerned about bras, because having a piece of wet fabric strapped around your chest makes you cold. So have you any opinions on what the best fabric is?
Well, I've already covered the two different types. The polyester is the most frequent base layer fabric, and that will wick outwards and wick inwards. So you have to be very careful that there's nothing over the top. Something I don't know whether merino wool is whether bras are available in merino wool, but that would certainly be very effective, and you would not feel any wet there, because as I've explained, the merino wool absorbs water, doesn't wick it, and it would always have a dry surface.
Okay, so merino wool, they are available, they're expensive, very expensive, but they are available. And John Kern says his merino wool trunks are just lovely. Thank you, John. We're glad to know that. Okay, I think we're done. Mike, can I ask you to do one thing? Because there's quite a lot of detail in this. If there were just 3 basic ideas you wanted us all to take away to do better in the future with our clothing, what would they be? What do you think are the 3 most important things we want to take from this?
3 takeaway. Thank you. Great question to close with. Yeah. Use of the wind shell.
Mm-hmm.
For the reasons explained, it saves. It prevents you overheating. It saves your. It increases the life of your waterproof and so on. Makes layering much more easier, and also because it's smooth and shiny, you can layer fleece or anything else over the top, so it goes on very easily and so on. The other is understanding wicking, that it wicks inwards. Mm-hmm. And think about directional wicking garments like Power Stretch and the Karrimor garments. Yeah, think about wicking. You need directional wicking. Most people do not understand that base layers wick inwards as well. So understanding the wicking is critical. After that, I would say it depends if you have hand problems. Particularly, females are more prone to hand problems, and I have hand problems and so on. So really think about, nobody talks about layering for hands.
Mhm.
And I haven't covered that because there's limits to how much I can cover. In Scandinavia, they talk about layering for hands, and they do a little bit, not so much in northern Canada. What people here are still looking for is the impossible, which is a thin, very warm glove. And what you need, what it really means is that you need an outer glove and an inner glove. What I've started to use in the last several years is something which has been produced for the runners as a simple outer thin waterproof outer shell, because that keeps the wind off your thin power stretch gloves underneath. The increase of warmth is just amazing. So it's really, really, really good. So think about layering, but also what it means is that you can have a glove underneath which is smartphone sensitive, so you could still have a glove underneath where you could tap on your phone and see your map and whatever app you want to use or something. Yeah. And one of the climbing companies, ME, has started to do the same as the running companies with a shell like that, a shell mitt. Yeah, and it has a cuff on where so you can slide the glove off quickly but keep it retained like in the very expensive gloves.
Thank you. That's a great piece of advice to finish on.